The NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3050 might be the first GPU to benefit, in a roundabout way, from the bonkers price gouging that's been spoiling the fun of graphics cards for nearly 2 years. In normal times, it wouldn't make much sense to buy this £239, $249 GPU, not because it's the lowest in the RTX range, but because the much more powerful RTX 3060 would only cost a few notes more. And yet, these are not normal times. While the MSI GeForce RTX 3050 Gaming X8G model I've tested has already ballooned to £380, $450, this leaves it looking like much more of a genuine alternative to RTX 3060, which is generally around £500 in the UK. And while it's ultimately still a 1080p specialist, the RTX 3050 takes a big step up from previous GTX 2050 GPUs by offering DLSS and ray tracing support. NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3050 specs: CUDA cores, 2560 base clock speed, 1.55 GHz, 1.55 GHz boost clock speed, 1.85 GHz as tested. Stock is 1.78 GHz. 1.85 GHz as tested. Stock is 1.78 GHz. VRAM. 8 GB GDDR6. 8 GB GDDR6 power. 130W. 130W recommended system power. 550W. 550W price. From £380, $450. With cool, quiet running to boot, and the fact that it's easy to find in stock, the RTX 3050 ends up as almost surprisingly viable option for new builds, even if its place among the best graphics cards is claimed partly through circumstance. Specs-wise, the move to NVIDIA's Ampere architecture gives the RTX 3050 all the same benefits as the rest of the 30 series. That means a massive rise in core count over the GTX 1650 and GTX 1650 Super, with those cores also running at higher base and boost clock speeds. The catch is that RTX 3050 is significantly thirstier for power. It's rated for 130W more than the GTX 1650 Super, though you can still keep it sated with a lower wattage PSU. MSI's version also comes with some nifty customizations. Besides the factory overclocked boost clock and a tidy metal backplate, the RTX 3050 Gaming X8Gs twin fan cooler is outstanding. It's whisper quiet even under load, and maintained a relatively chilly 61 to 63 degrees Celsius during sustained benchmarking. I suspect that if prices do ever come down, these additions will preclude it dropping to the base £239, $249. But for now it's nice to get such premium design on a technically lower-end graphics card. RTX 3050 Performance, 1080p benchmarks. The RPS Test PC, CPU, Intel Core i5-11600K. Intel Core i5-11600K RAM. 16GB Corsair Vengeance LPX. 16GB Corsair Vengeance LPX motherboard, Asus TUF Gaming Z590 Plus Wi-Fi. Asus TUF Gaming Z590 Plus Wi-Fi PSU, Corsair RM850X. But enough about counting coins, let's count frames instead. On its home turf of 1080p, the RTX 3050 won't do 60 frames per second on max settings as consistently as the RTX 3060, and certainly not the RTX 3060 Ti. But it never truly struggles either. And for those who own the best gaming monitors with heightened refresh rates, this GPU will cruise through less demanding games without sacrificing quality. Hitman 3, for example, got a 95 frames per second average in the Dubai benchmark with ultra-quality graphics. The more intensive Dartmoor benchmark averaged 86 frames per second. With high settings, these results rose to 101 frames per second and 89 frames per second respectively. Forza Horizon 4 ain't no thing on ultra quality either. The RTX 3050 pumped out 119 frames per second on average, And it would take a seriously trained pair of eyes to tell the difference between the RTX 3060's 135 frames per second in the same test. In several of our test games, the RTX 3050 fell just short of 60 frames per second on their respective maximum quality presets, only to climb back above that magic number with some tactical lowering. Both Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Assassin's Creed Valhalla were two such games. Odyssey's benchmark averaged 50 frames per second on ultra high, which is still pretty smooth, then rocketed up to 82 frames per second on high. Valhalla managed 55 frames per second on ultra high, then hit 64 frames per second on high. Total War: Three Kingdoms was another, scoring 50 frames per second in the battle benchmark on ultra before a switch to medium boosted it to 119 frames per second. Others don't even need the help. Horizon Zero Dawn averaged 67 frames per second on ultimate quality, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider even managed 60 frames per second using both the highest quality preset and ultra-quality ray-traced shadows. Granted, enabling this GPU's ray tracing features won't always have such smooth results. Metro Exodus 4.1 averaged a playable but unimpressive 36 frames per second with ultra-quality graphics and RT effects, a visible drop from its 47 frames per second on ultra graphics alone. In a similar vein, switching on the fancier visual features in Final Fantasy XV devastated the frame rate, dropping from 69 frames per second with the highest preset, to be fair, to 39 frames per second with turf effects and hairworks enabled. Even the old GTX 1650 didn't take such a big hit. With ray tracing specifically, however, it's not always asking too much of the RTX 3050. While DLSS is generally intended for use with resolutions of 1440p and above, it can be deployed at 1080p to reduce ray tracing's performance cost. Metro Exodus is a perfect example. With DLSS on its highest setting, quality, it completely eliminated the ray tracing tax and carried the average frame rate back up to 48 frames per second. Even when it doesn't wipe out the loss entirely, it's still extremely useful to have DLSS in your pocket. Without it, Watch Dogs Legion ran at 48 frames per second on ultra quality at DLSS, and that's up to a slick 58 frames per second. You can even add medium quality ray tracing and still get a playable 41 frames per second on average. Overall, the RTX 3050 lands exactly where you'd expect it to, namely between the GTX 1650 and the RTX 3060. The latter does have a meaningful speed advantage. On our old test rig, with a slightly slower Intel Core i5-10600K, it averaged 59 frames per second in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, 63 frames per second in Metro Exodus, 90 frames per second in Horizon Zero Dawn, and 60 frames per second in Watch Dogs Legion. That's all at max quality, without DLSS. Still, for an extra £120, it's also not the kind of advantage you should go out of your way for. Not at this resolution, anyway. RTX 3050 Performance, 1440p benchmarks. To the RTX 3050's credit, it can at least run most games at max quality 1440p, it's just skirting the line on some of them. Three Kingdoms battle benchmark, for example, just crept to 31 frames per second on ultra, dropping to medium produced a dramatically smoother 73 frames per second. Watch Dogs Legion also averaged a leisurely 36 frames per second on ultra quality, though another benefit of 1440p is that it's a better fit for DLSS upscaling. With this, it managed 47 frames per second, though throwing in medium ray tracing bumped it down to 41 frames per second. Final Fantasy XV, meanwhile, averaged 48 frames per second on highest, though adding the bonus effects still takes a heavy toll. It drops to 36 frames per second with turf effects and hairworks on. Horizon Zero Dawn fared better, averaging 53 frames per second on ultimate, and climbing with 63 frames per second with the addition of quality level DLSS. Hitman 3, too, was as smooth as 47's head, hitting 66 frames per second on the Dubai benchmark